From the moment of birth right through adolescence, they get nothing but the strongest physical affection. It's this contact, the nursing, the touching, the cuddling, that may be the key to the nonviolent society, not the fact that they're far removed from the horrors of civilization.
Along the way, hammered into your head is the inevitable nature versus nurture, and that's at least up there with Coke versus Pepsi or Greeks versus Trojans. So nature versus nurture.
Just things that make us behave in a particular way regardless of our environment. Genes give us different ways of responding to our environment. In fact, it looks as if some of the early childhood influences of a kind of child rearing affects gene expression, actually turning on and off different genes to put you on a different developmental track, which may suit the kind of world you've got to deal with.
So, for example, a study done in Montreal with suicide victims looked at autopsies of the brains of these people. And it turned out that if a suicide victim, these are usually young adults, had been abused as children, the abuse actually caused a genetic change in the brain that was absent in the brains of people who had not been abused. That's an epigenetic effect. Epi means on top of, so that the epigenetic influence is what happens environmentally to either activate or deactivate certain genes.
In New Zealand, there's a study that was done in a town called Dunedin, in which a few thousand individuals were studied from birth up to into their 20s. What they found was that they could identify a genetic mutation, an abnormal gene, which did have some relation to the predisposition to commit violence, but only if the individual had also been subjected to severe child abuse. In other words, a child with this abnormal gene would be no more likely to be violent than anybody else, and in fact they actually had a lower rate of violence than people with normal genes, as long as they weren't abused as children.
If we wish to understand what then makes some people susceptible, we actually have to look at their life experience. The old idea, although it's old, but it's still broadly held, that addictions are due to some genetic cause is simply scientifically untenable. What the case is actually is that certain life experiences make people susceptible. Life experiences that not only shape the person's personality and psychological needs, but also their very brains in certain ways. And that process begins in utero. It's been shown, for example, that if you stress mothers during pregnancy, their children are more likely to have traits that predispose them to addictions. And that's because development is shaped by the psychological and social environment. So the biology of human beings is very much affected by and programmed by their life experiences beginning in utero. Stress animals in a laboratory when they're pregnant, and their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. You can stress human mothers. For example, in a British study, women who are abused in pregnancy will have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their placenta at birth, and their children are more likely to have conditions that predispose them to addictions by age 7 or 8. So in utero stress already prepares the ground for all kinds of mental health issues. Israeli study done prior on children born to mothers who were pregnant prior to the onset of the 1967 war. These women, of course, are very stressed, and their offspring have a higher incidence of schizophrenia than the average cohort. So there's plenty of evidence now that prenatal effects have a huge impact on the developing human being. The point about human development, and specifically human brain development, is that it occurs mostly under the impact of the environment and mostly after birth. Now, if you compare us to a horse, which can run on the first day of life, we see that we are very undeveloped. We can't muster that much neurological coordination, balance, muscle strength, visual acuity until a year and a half, 2 years. And that's because the brain development that in the horse happens in the safety of the womb, in a human being has to happen after birth. And that has to do with simple evolutionary logic. As the head gets larger, which is what makes us into human beings, the burgeoning of the forebrain is what creates the human species, actually. At the same time, we walk on two legs, so our pelvis narrows to accommodate that. So now we have a narrower pelvis, a larger head. Bingo, we have to be born prematurely. And that means that the brain development that in other animals occurs in utero, in us, occurs after birth. And much of that under the impact of the environment. And the concept of neural Darwinism simply means that the circuits that get the appropriate input from the environment will develop optimally, and the ones that don't will either not develop optimally or perhaps not at all. If you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life, because the circuits of vision require light waves for their development. And without that, even the rudimentary circuits present and active at birth will atrophy and die, and new ones will not develop. There's a significant way in which early experiences shape adult behavior, and even and especially early experiences for which there's no recall memory. It turns out that there are two kinds of memory. There is explicit memory, which is recall. This is when you can call back facts, details, episodes, circumstances. But the structure in the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which encodes recall memory, it doesn't even begin to develop fully until a year and a half, and it's not fully developed till much later, which is why hardly anybody has any recall memory prior to 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is called implicit memory, which is in fact an emotional memory, where the emotional impact and the interpretation that the child makes of those emotional experiences is ingrained in the brain in the form of nerve circuits ready to fire without specific recall. So to give you a clear example, people who are adopted have a lifelong sense of rejection very often. They can't recall the adoption, they can't recall the separation from birth mother, because there's nothing there to recall with. But the emotional memory of separation and rejection is deeply embedded in their brains. Hence, they're much more likely to experience a sense of rejection and a great emotional upset when they perceive themselves as being rejected than other people. That's not unique to people who are adopted, but it's particularly strong in them because of this function of implicit memory. People who are addicted, given that they, according to all the research literature, certainly in my experience, the hardcore addicts virtually were all significantly abused as children or suffered severe emotional loss. Their emotional or implicit memories are those of a world that's not safe and not helpful, caregivers who are not to be trusted, and relationships that are not safe enough to open up to vulnerably. And hence their responses tend to be to keep themselves separate from really intimate relationships, not to trust caregivers, doctors and other people who are trying to help them, and generally see the world as an unsafe place. And that's strictly a function of implicit memory, which sometimes has to do with incidents they don't even recall. Infants who are born premature are often in incubators and various types of gadgetry and machinery for weeks and perhaps months. It's now known that if these children are touched and stroked on the back for just 10 minutes a day, that promotes their brain development. So human touch is essential for development. And in fact, infants who are never picked up will actually die. That's how much of a fundamental need being held is to human beings. In our society, there's an unfortunate...
Let me show you a monkey raised on a nursing wire mother. Now here are 106's two mothers. As you can see, it was weaned on a wire mother. Here's baby 106. Watch. He's going to the wire mother. It's got to eat to live.
Oh, he's going back.
He's back on the cloth mother, and he'll stay on the cloth mother. Actually, this baby spends from 17 to 18 hours a day on the cloth mother and less than 1 hour a day on the wire mother. We had predicted that the variable of contact comfort would be a variable of measurable importance, but we were unprepared to find that it completely overwhelmed and overshadowed all other variables, including those of nursing.
Next, Len and Harlow tested the strength of a baby's love for its mother. Just how unpleasant would the cloth mother have to be before the baby monkey ceased to want it?
What I did was to try and provide a mother, a cloth mother, that the infant would become attached to, but which would provide a kind of rejection, which meant that what I did was used compressed air to blow a blast of air at the kid at some periodic interval. The baby then steps off, gets away, and then what happens? That's the question. Does the kid say, well, I don't want any more of this. This is not for me. No, just the opposite. The theory is this. What if every time you're emotionally upset, you do the thing that you always do when you're emotionally upset, you rush to your mother. But now when you're on your mother, I make you even more emotionally upset. What do? Well, you want to be on your mother even more. There's a linkage between the infant's emotional state and its desire to be on the mother, even if the mother is the source of that emotional distress.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, but when I was working with delinquent children, I was young, I was sort of 20, but I was surprised by the extent to which these children who frankly had abusive mothers didn't matter how badly their mothers had behaved to them. They would get really, really angry if you ever accused their mothers of being in any way inadequate.
Absolutely the case, and it was exactly those kinds of observations at the human level that was a natural bridge for us to study.
The great British child psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott said that fundamentally two things can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't happen, and then things that should happen but don't. And the first category is the traumatic and abusive and abandonment experiences of my downtown East Side patients and of many addicts. That's what shouldn't happen but did. But then there is the non-stressed, attuned, non-distracted attention of the parent that every child needs, that very often children don't get. They're not abused, they're not neglected, and they're not traumatized. But what should happen, the presence of the emotionally available, nurturing parent, just is not available to them because of the stresses in our society and the parenting environment. And the psychologist Alan Shore calls that proximal abandonment, when the parent is physically present but emotionally absent.